Next, we have one more Brian Bellendorf, who's leading the Linux Foundation Public Health as well as the COVID Credentials Initiative. So, Brian, take it away.
Okay, and I'll share my screen here. I think this is what they call, by the way, Brian A and Brian B, A/B testing. I might go for the pun. Apologies to everyone for that. But we have a slightly different take. Let me do a quick kind of like top-down introduction. So I'm Brian Bellendorf. I'm Managing Director for Blockchain Healthcare and Identity Initiatives at the Linux Foundation. Been here for almost 5 years, focusing primarily first on a blockchain project we've had called Hyperledger, which has actually had, interestingly enough, and kind of unanticipated at the beginning, digital identity at the core of a lot of its use cases and deployments. The Linux Foundation as a whole is a 501c6 industry consortium. It's not a charitable organization, but we do have a public benefit mission around what we do. And it's coordinated the development of not just the Linux operating system and the Kubernetes cloud container community, but also major software initiatives in automotive, in special effects houses, in telco hardware and software, in all these, in about 200 different domains. And this is our first step into healthcare and our first step into really a public-facing kind of project. So Linux Foundation Public Health, let me just advance here, was started in about April of last year, as many of us sat around and realized that getting communities to work together on common code was sometimes the fastest way to solve a systemic problem. And it was also the fastest way to drive kind of a standardized approach to tackling certain things, especially where trust was a major issue. And we felt that as these apps were to start to be rolled out to do exposure notification, to automate other parts of contact tracing, and many of us were thinking even back in April about verifiable credentials for vaccinations and such, and test results and those sorts of things, as also being a key place where trust in the technology world, which is strained right now, trust in major Silicon Valley companies, trust in the way that the internet works, obviously very highly under strain, would be put further under strain if suddenly digital health records were flying around in a way that they hadn't really been before. So we started this and focused initially on exposure notification as an initiative, and launched a couple of projects that some of you might be familiar with: COVID Green, COVID Shield, and a new one called Herald, actually, which is focused on kind of workplace exposure notification. Put the flag in the ground pretty strong early on the Google Apple exposure notification APIs as being the kind of core, the best balancing act between privacy and confidentiality and efficacy. And in fact, now have launched a bunch of services that support the EN Express approach that Google and Apple have also additionally rolled out, including analytics servers that operate in a privacy preserving way. Our members include a roster of companies that have been active in this space, as well as relationships with the public health authorities. But really, the mission that we've oriented it around is how do we build software that helps public health authorities in particular in the fight against this pandemic, but also lays the groundwork for fighting, knock on wood, horribly not, but future pandemics, future mutations of this pandemic, or other public health crises. And so COVID Shield is the default app behind Canada's exposure notification app. COVID Green is the one behind Ireland's, as well as New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Delaware, and a number of other states and countries. And this idea of collaborating on common code and then allowing them to be white labeled or rebranded or integrated into other people's products and services is a recurring pattern in open source software, a recurring pattern in the way the Linux Foundation runs its projects. And it fit very well here for helping give the public health authorities the technology they needed to automate EM. And now stepping into credentials. So as I mentioned, some of us did anticipate fairly early on that there would be a need to think about how to make the digital, the yellow card that all of us were so used to using before digitized, and some additional kind of concerns about privacy and confidentiality if it were to be used to gate access to restaurants or concerts or even public spaces, perhaps, where the kinds of privacy balancing act that you have when you're boarding a flight to another country, is very different than those other circumstances. And also realizing that we've now built through this kind of different approach to online digital identity, something called self-sovereign identity, or sometimes user-centric identity, a different approach to an alternative really to log in with Facebook, log in with Twitter, log in with your insurance company credentials, where not only are you notifying them all when you use those kinds of credentials or access that information, you're also kind of leaving control of those records up to them, and that's a very dangerous kind of thing. Instead, what has emerged in the W3C and other places are a set of standards that make self-sovereign identity and kind of the individual as the pivot point for the sharing of their records much more effective. So starting in March, this volunteer group called the COVID Creds Initiative started to pull together a set of companies that have been operating in this space, startups predominantly, other companies who had plays here, not as marquee a roster perhaps as you see on some other projects, but a lot of those companies watching from the periphery and getting involved at the point where COVID Cred came into part of Linux Foundation Public Health now. And now we've provided a proper home for them and given that effort some structure. And the main goal here is very much like we've done with exposure notification, organize the different efforts that are happening out there into a kind of a common map, help people understand what are the different reference points for deciding on that spectrum between privacy preservation and efficiency or efficacy, where they might want to land. And then going out and recruiting software initiatives to be homed at the Linux at LFPH to go and tackle some key initiatives or some key challenges in these different projects. Verifiable credentials, as this different approach to digital identity, need to stand up to a couple of criteria that both people associate with paper credentials, but also that potentially provide some benefit from being digital. Right, the user needs to feel empowered that they have control over those credentials and how they're being shared. They need some reassurance that this isn't like cookies. As somebody who participated in the HTTP standards process in the early 90s and even volunteered a standard that became the cookie standard under a different name, some degree of remorse over the way that it became a tracking device for people as they bounced around the web. And many people saw that pattern and will be damned if they repeat that mistake when it comes to digital identity and these kinds of credentials. So addressing traceability across different uses of these credentials is super important, perhaps more important than it is in the physical world. But just like with paper, it should be portable, it should be tamper evident, there should be a high degree of interoperability. I should be able to get a vaccination from a clinic in California, use it to board a plane to cross into another country, and then go attend a concert in that country, all with these possibly being very different trust frameworks or trust networks, but with an interoperability, not just in the format of the credential, but in how that gets trusted across those three different domains. And this is where it's key as you think about the three-party problem here in building the system in such a way that the verifying party does not need to have a direct integration or go through a third-party intermediary with the issuer of that credential to be able to verify its integrity associated with the person presenting that credential and being able to have all their questions answered about is this person suitable to come in, and that could be based on a picture of that person, a biometric, it lines up with who it is. It could be based on some other type of presentation of credential, a driver's license or passport, but you actually want to avoid those scenarios. Data minimization is incredibly important to trying to keep PII from leaking all over the place or having to depend upon regulation as your stopgap for keeping PII from being shared. And so wherever possible, you can get to a verifiable credential that doesn't have to access a bigger medical record, doesn't have to call home to any service. It allows you just to say, this person has received a vaccine as attested to by somebody trusted as part of this framework. I'm good enough to let them into my nightclub, into my restaurant, or into my country, right? That should be the goal that we're aiming for. And really what sits at the heart of this is the establishment of a public utility, not a company, not a nonprofit even, not a government agency, but something as coordinated. Perhaps you could think of it as similar to the way that the internet infrastructure is coordinated through a combination of trust frameworks, a combination of technologies, and a combination of organizations working together to make this kind of thing operate in a very privacy-preserving way. And so time is pretty short. I do want to leave time for conversation. I'll just mention we've got efforts both on the kind of mapping and analyzing and understanding where the different technology efforts happening here. We're not a standards body. We look very much forward to working with MITRE on how that might work, but we're also very interested in the ecosystem development side. And let me just jump forward here to show these governance authorities are the kinds of things that public health authorities will really play a very strong role in establishing. They'll have to, because they're the ones that will be authorizing the different injection sites, the different vaccination sites, as well as be connected to the parties that are badging in access to a country or otherwise being able to say these are legitimate operators. And so this is why the public health authorities we've built relationships with are key players in this. We have published a governance framework document that helps explain to the public health authorities what this kind of thing means in this kind of self-sovereign identity kind of world. And this is, by the way, the basis for many of the projects you see, such as IBM Health Pass, such as the work that Oracle and others are doing. Figuring out how to do this, though, in a vendor-neutral way, in a way that doesn't get so tightly locked down and siloed, and worst of all, would require you to have multiple apps or receive multiple vaccinations. These are all the kinds of things that we're out here to try to prevent from happening. So, long story short, lots of different work streams going on, building on top of pre-existing standards, as well as working with folks like MITRE and others. Our core focus, though, is software. We're right now that we've kind of established the landscape, engaged with a number of organizations to bring in code to serve as a wallet, as an issuer app, as a verifier app. We don't expect one app to serve everybody's needs, but we think if you can share 95% of the code, especially those that are security sensitive, you can go a long way, particularly in the interest of the public health authorities, in establishing common adoption. This is how the most successful open standards have always been adopted, has been through a accompanying set of high quality reference, but production quality open source software that implements those standards. And if you are interested in getting involved, let me know. Lots of different places to coordinate, as well as just to keep tabs on what we're working on. And with that, I'll take a breath. Thank you all.